My grandpa saw some serious shit as a cop. Bye, sassy banana. Technically, I'm not supposed to be telling anyone this, but I feel like this needs to be shared. I do feel a bit guilty, but someone needs to hear this. And no sleep seems like the perfect place to put this. So my grandpa is a pretty reserved man. He's usually emotionally stoic and doesn't regale the adventures of his past years too often. But once in a blue moon, you can get him to tell you one of his killer stories. I've heard plenty of stories from my grandpa before. All of them have been either incredibly amazing or just utterly bewildering. My mom says that the best stories my grandpa has are from his war days and when he was a police officer. Last night it was just me and my grandpa at home together, and we got into a pretty deep conversation while sitting in the living room. We somehow ended up on the topic of his law enforcement days. I knew my grandpa didn't like dwell on this particular topic, but my nagging curiosity got the better of me. Hey grandpa, what do you think was the worst thing you saw being a cop? Aside from like murders and stuff, I mean. Suicide. His answer was curt and emotionless. I knew he was trying to avoid the topic entirely, but the nosy bitch in me still wanted to hear the details. How many cases did you see? Just one. This time I could see a twinge of sadness creeping up into his eyes. Whatever he was remembering was something he wanted to forget. As much as it pained me to see my grandpa like this, I had to hear this story. I asked as delicately as I could, "What happened?" He stared at the wall for a second before sighing and turning slowly to face me. "Bud, promise me you won't repeat this to anyone, and I mean anyone. Not your mother, not your friends, not your sister, not even your grandma. No one." That last part kinda shocked me. From what I've heard from my grandma knew absolutely everything that happened to my grandpa when he was in both the service and the police force. There wasn't anything he told my family that she hadn't heard before, but apparently she didn't know about this. I agreed to keep his vow of silence, and leaned in to hear my grandpa's unspoken tale. This is what he told me. My grandpa was working late when a message came in through his radio about assistance being needed with a home investigation on the other side of town. A call had come into the station from a worried woman, saying that she hadn't heard from her neighbor in over 2 weeks, and was beginning to think something terrible had happened. My grandpa, as well two other cruisers of officers, were dispatched out to the house of the man in question. According to my grandpa, the man's house was up in a place known as Pill Hill. The area had been nicknamed as such by the locals because the only people who lived up there were excessively wealthy doctors. When my grandpa arrived, the other two officers were already there. There was no answer when they knocked on the door, so they had to forcibly enter the guy's home. My grandpa said that this place was one of the biggest houses he'd ever seen. By the looks of everything, this guy probably wiped his ass with $20 bills. The walls seemed to go on for miles in practically every room, and priceless antiques and expensive-looking furniture littered the place. As nice as the house was, my grandpa said something about it wasn't right. All the furniture had been turned upside down, or clustered in front of all the closet doors. Something even more unsettling my grandpa had noticed was that whoever had been in the house had taken all the mirrors off the walls, which were now resting on the floor, and covered them completely in black electrical tape, or broke them. Aside from the weird placement of the furniture and the mirrors, the house looked normal. There was no sign of a struggle or forced entry. The place looked virtually untouched by any kind of criminal activity. The house was enormous, and had dozens of different rooms that needed to be explored. Since there was only 3 men on site, taking the time to look in every room was a pretty time-consuming task. The longer my grandpa looked, the more he began to feel uneasy. The house looked inhabited, but there was no one to be found. About 10 minutes into the search, my grandpa took the liberty of heading upstairs alone, while the two other officers were still spread out across the massive lower floor. It only took my grandpa a few minutes to realize that something upstairs was very wrong. There was shattered glass everywhere, and all the furniture was destroyed. Upon further inspection, all the glass scattered around appeared to be mirror shards. Every single one of the rooms were trashed, and nothing was in one piece. My grandpa called for the guys downstairs to come up to the second floor and look through all the mess he was standing in. The three of them began to look in all of the various rooms in hope that the owner of the home was upstairs somewhere. That's when things began to get unsettling. As my grandpa investigated the upper level, himself and the other officers were seeing something unusual. In almost every single one of the rooms, there was a recurring phrase scratched into the walls. We many. What those words mean, I have no idea, and neither does my grandpa. Needless to say, everyone in the house was beginning to feel uneasy. Something was indeed very wrong. My grandpa tried to calm his nerves by rationalizing that maybe this man had a history of mental illness, or took some sort of medication that made him act erratically. Obviously, whoever owned this house was the culprit of all the disarray. But where the hell was he? At this point in the story, it was clear that my grandpa was beginning to relive everything that happened that night. The ending was close, I could tell, and it wasn't going to be good. I just stared at my grandpa, practically leaning inches from his face to hear the climax. He looked me straight in the eyes with an expression of honest fear and horror seeping from his aged face. He let out a ragged breath. That's when we found him. My grandpa was the first one to enter what appeared to be the man's master bedroom. Blood. There was blood everywhere. It stained the floor like a gruesome tie-dye. The officers who were following closely behind my grandpa stood stock still in utter horror, slowly turning their heads to gaze upon the vast quantity of blood that was spilled inside the room. One of the officers quickly radioed the station to dispatch a team of paramedics and any additional officers. Something awful happened here. Looking closer at the blood, it appeared that there was a long stain that led into a small passage brain off of the room. Moving painfully slow, my grandpa in the lead, the men made their way into the passage that appeared to lead to another room. After following the trail of blood to its end, which wasn't that far, my grandpa and his fellow officers ended up in the master bathroom. Then is when they saw him. The missing man was lying sprawled out in the large clawfoot tub, dead. He was stark naked and was hanging over the left side of the tub, his arm limp, and his curled fingers pressing against the stained tile. Just like the bedroom, the bathroom was covered in an unnatural amount of blood. It was running down the walls, slathered across the tiles, and even formed a small puddle in the sink. How that much blood could come out of one human being, I have no idea. And in like every other room, the same words were written on the wall. Only this time they were smeared in blood, in barely legible English, and were missing the first half. Many. This is where my grandpa began to get shaky. I could see the tremors he was trying to so hard to suppress rack his hands and lower lip. I could hear the crack in his voice when he spoke. And his face, oh God, his face. The man's head was lolled to the side. His face was directed towards the door of the bathroom, where my grandpa and the other two men were standing. According to my grandpa, his eyes were wide open, and the corners of his mouth were pulled up into a twisted smile, like he was laughing at the expressions of horror spread across the living officers' faces. Although every officer present was terrified, they had to do their job and figure out how this poor soul had died, and whether this had been a murder. Upon further inspection, it appeared the man had slit his wrists. The cuts were inflicted with a rather large shard of glass, which was found lying inside the tub, and ran almost the full length of his arm, starting at his wrist and stopping near his elbow. Both arms had been cut, and it was obvious that his wounds were self-inflicted. This was a suicide, a very gruesome one. Not long after the man had been discovered, the paramedics arrived, along with two other policemen, and all of the officers ventured downstairs to convey what had transpired. My grandpa said he had a hell of a time trying to explain to the paramedics what lay waiting for them upstairs. Being a respectful man, my grandpa decided to wait to leave until the deceased man was brought downstairs and taken out of the home. Wanting to be alone for a moment, to collect his thoughts. He wandered into the living room to sit down for a bit. He pulled a lone chair away from a cluster of various furniture pieces and took a seat. With closed eyes, he craned his head back in an attempt to rid his mind of the disturbing scene that he had just bore witness to. When he opened his eyes, that's when he saw them. Footprints, human footprints, and handprints covered the ceiling, all of them done in blood. My dad used to work as a cop. This is the worst thing he ever experienced on the job. By mouse curtains. Warning: this story contains sexual and physical violence towards children. Viewer discretion is advised. My dad used to be a great dad. He used to take me out to watch baseball games, and we used to play soccer whenever he was free. He worked nights, but he still made as much time as possible for me and my mom. He was a great dad. Around the time I turned 10, he changed. He became a recluse, spending as much time away from home as possible, and when he had to return for a new shirt or a shower, he reeked of cigarettes and alcohol. He stopped being able to look me in the eye, choosing to ignore when I asked him to play with me outside. This spiraling into despair eventually caused my mom to file for divorce, and my dad settled for custody every other weekend. About 2 years later, he quit the job and started going to therapy. Now, as I turn 22, he's still not the happy-go-lucky man from 12 years ago, but he's a lot better, just more complacent and slightly somber. I decided to visit him for the week, see how he was getting on. He never remarried, nor had a girlfriend after my mom. Not that I would completely be aware if he had, but I feel like he would have probably mentioned it at some point. To be honest, I had some ulterior motives with the visit. Reading some of the stories on Reddit about EMTs, police, and search and rescue officers, and their creepiest experiences on the job made me want to find out if my dad had anything horrifying to relay to me. I sort of wish I hadn't asked him now. What he told me was a lot worse than some paranormal being lurking in the woods. It was downright disgusting. I'll format the story as if my dad were speaking in first person, just like how he told me the sequence of events. This story details terrible sexual and physical violence towards children. Please read at your own peril. It was 2008, and you had just turned 10, remember? I bought you that little red bike. Yeah, you used to ride that damn thing all day inside the house, and your mother went ballistic. Not on the carpets, Johnny. It was pretty funny. Anyway, it's winter, so the roads are seriously icy. The snow is coming down heavy. It was almost like a blizzard. Rick and I, you remember Rick, right? Big black mustache. Got shot in the foot in 2009 during a drugs bust. He used to come to all your birthday parties. Ah, well, it doesn't really matter if you can't remember him. It's not that important that you know what he looks like. We're parked on the edge of an intersection on highway, redacted to watch for speeders and idiots without their headlights on. Pretty boring stuff. So we're just sat there when suddenly the radio turns on. Requests back up to a house in the rough part of town. We'd only been parked there for 10 minutes, but it was a long 10 minutes. So we're thinking, oh hell yeah, some real work. And so we bust our asses over there. Fast. Well, as fast as we could have. Like I said, the roads were icy. When we arrived, we realized there's only one other cop car there, with two officers stood near the hood of the car, waiting for us, pistols locked and loaded in their hands. Now, I cannot for the life of me remember their names, but one of them was a young fella, new and all. We'll call him B and his older partner A. They brief us with the situation. A little boy called from inside the house, identified himself as missing 9-year-old Samuel Morrison, said a man had snatched him off his bike and taken him to this abandoned house. Apparently, the perpetrator had a mobile phone that the boy managed to sneak away to call the police with. So busts down the door, tells anyone who's in the house to show themselves now. This house is a big house, let me tell you that. It's 3 stories high with a basement and large open empty rooms. Nobody shows themselves, so we keep clearing room after room, slowly ascending through the house. Every step causes large creaks to echo around us. And if I'm honest with you, kid, I was thoroughly freaked out. Something just did not sit right with me. We decided to split up, A and B taking the basement, and Rick and I making our way to the top floor. The thing is, the house barely looked lived in at all. The whole thing smelt of bleach, and there were no cobwebs or anything. It just seemed to clean and new and preserved. You know that feeling of just pure dread when your stomach feels as though it's being dragged on the floor behind you. I never really had experienced that feeling until that day. When we finally reached the top floor, we noticed a small, shadowy figure standing in the last room at the end of the hallway, facing us. Rick shouted at it something like, "Hey Samuel, you're safe now. It's us, the cops." But when we got closer, and I shined my flashlight at it, nothing could have prepared us for what we saw. It was Samuel, all right, but not as we had hoped to find him. His eyes were sewn open, and they rolled back into his head. His skin was pale and blotchy, and his swollen tongue lolled out of his mouth. He had strings attached to his wrists, head, waist, and knees, causing him to seem as though he were standing upright. Rick began to retch, and to make things worse, the strings suddenly snapped, dropping the poor kid's lifeless body onto a crumpled heap of rotting kid meat on the floor. I rushed towards it to find that a large, man-sized hole in the ceiling that led to the basement. I couldn't see anything up there, so I ran back to try and catch the sick fuck that would have done this to a little boy. Rick had gone, I assumed, back to A and B to call for help, but when I got up there was no one there. A window in the attic was open, but it was far too small for someone to have escaped through. It didn't make any sense. I noticed a small tape recorder on the floor. I swear I didn't even press play on the damn thing, but it started to make sounds. It was muffled, but I eventually made out what sounded like a 911 call in Samuel's voice. It had been recorded. I realized then and there that the whole thing was some perverted setup. The forensics team was called to clear the crime scene away, and we filed a report, but we had no suspects. The poor kid's body had been washed with bleach, and there was no foreign DNA on him. He had been raped, his genitalia was swollen and bruised, and his throat and anus were filled with fissures. The perpetrator had most likely moved his body to the abandoned house from the original crime scene to further hide his identity. We never found the guy. Thing is, when they went to search the house the next day, they found footprints in the snow leading up to the woods. The soles of the shoes were sanded down, so they couldn't reveal any recognizable shoe brand or print. If he left after we did, which is the most likely scenario seeing as we didn't see anyone leave, nor were the prints there before, it meant he was still inside the house with us. That's the bit that always fucks with me the most. He was probably still in the attic, whilst I hopelessly searched for him, probably grinning at me from the darkness. My best guess is he was standing on the wooden beams above me. You know those beams that keep the roof stable. The sick fuck was probably staring down at me. It still doesn't make sense as to how nobody found him when the whole forensics team and other fresh-eyed cops were searching the place. Maybe he was hiding in the walls. I don't know. I don't really want to know. I've removed myself from that case. That's why I started drinking, son. You see, Samuel looked a lot like you, and he got kidnapped off his bike. All I could think was, what if it'd been you? What if that sick fuck had gotten to you? It still haunts me to think about it. Rick and I used to talk about it, speculate about it. That young fella B quit almost immediately after that, moved town. Apparently they found child pornography on his computer. But that was just a rumor some of the other guys came up with as a joke. Still sticks with me, that one. That's when my dad stopped talking about it. He said he didn't want to talk anymore, and I understand why. It makes me feel sick just thinking about it. Let me know what you guys think.